Her father sold her future for the price of his debts, and Helena Ashbury heard it happen before she ever saw the ink dry. She had not meant to linger outside the study. She had gone in search of a misplaced book, one of the few comforts left to her in a house that now hummed with unease, but the low murmur of men's voices slid under the door and rooted her to the threadbare runner. "You will have her, Redcliffe," her father said, his usually jovial tone thinned by desperation, "and in return you will see these accounts adjusted." Papers rustled, a decanter clinked, and Baron Redcliffe's reply oiled through the crack, smooth and satisfied, as he remarked that Lady Helena was a pretty enough collateral, as though she were no more than a parcel of land, a mare, a thing to be inspected and owned. Helena's stomach turned to ice. For a wild, rebellious moment, she nearly flung the door open and shouted that she was not for sale, that she would sooner scrub floors than climb into that man's carriage. But the image of her younger sister's pale face rose up, of the servants who depended on Ashbury wages to feed their children, and the words died like sparks against wet stone. Slowly, she sank back into the shadowed corridor, fingers pressed so tightly over her mouth that her jaw ached, listening as her father laughed a touch too loudly, and Redcliffe set terms in the lazy drawl of a man who has never been refused anything he wanted. They spoke of dowry, of settlements, of how fortunate it was that the Baron's generosity might rescue the failing estate, and with every casual phrase, Helena felt another piece of herself peeled away, labelled, priced. When at last chairs scraped, and footsteps moved toward the door, she slipped around the corner, back straight, face smoothed into the careful composure she had worn like armor, since whispers of ruin first crept through the halls. In the cracked pier glass of the hallway she caught her reflection, veiled in dust motes and late afternoon light, and hardly recognized the dark-eyed woman staring back. Somewhere in London, she thought bitterly, men toasted each other in warm clubs, congratulating themselves on clever bargains, and one of them had just purchased her life. She did not yet know that another man, a duke with winter in his gaze and a conscience he had tried very hard to bury, would hear of this profitable alliance and feel something sharp and unwelcome catch beneath his ribs. She knew only that the world had shifted, and that if she did nothing, the next time that study door closed it would be behind her, with no one left outside to listen and object. In that dim corridor, Helena made a silent, trembling promise to herself that if she must be bartered like coin, she would, at the very least, learn the exact price of her own surrender tonight. Baron Redcliffe arrived at Ashbury Hall the next morning with the punctuality of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere, his carriage wheels crunching over the gravel with a confidence that made Helena's skin prickle long before he stepped through the door. The household had been roused early to prepare for him. Footmen polished silver until their fingers reddened, maids scattered fresh rushes in the entryway, and Helena's father paced the hall like a schoolboy awaiting praise. Helena descended the staircase slowly, every step an effort to maintain composure as her heart thudded with the memory of last night's overheard betrayal. Redcliffe stood below, tall and broad, his dark hair slicked back with oil, his smile a stretched imitation of charm that never reached his calculating eyes. The moment he saw her, that smile widened in triumph rather than admiration, and he bowed with the exaggerated grace of a man who believes himself irresistible. "Lady Helena," he said with a warmth that felt like fingers closing around her throat, "I trust the morning finds you well." She inclined her head, murmuring the expected courtesies, though inside she felt hollowed out, her voice a small fragile thing fighting to stay steady. Her father beamed with relief at her politeness, taking the Baron's arm and leading him toward the drawing-room as if nothing were amiss, as if she had not been priced and bartered like a broodmare only hours earlier. Helena followed, her silk skirts whispering over the floor, the sound too soft to drown out her father's obsequious laughter and Redcliffe's patronizing assurances that he was honored, to save their family from disgrace. Every word tasted of rot. She sat beside her father on a settee upholstered in fading damask, hands laced tightly enough to ache while Redcliffe outlined his proposal, though it was clear the decision had already been made in a smoky study, without her presence, her consent, her humanity. He described the union as a benevolent act, speaking of duty, stability, and the promise of restoring Ashbury's reputation, each phrase masking the ownership he fully intended to claim. Helena nodded where expected, her face a mask carved of courtly obedience, even as her pulse hammered in her ears and heat coiled beneath her ribs, a slow-growing fury she had never before allowed herself to feel. When the Baron lifted her hand for a kiss and let his thumb linger a fraction too long against her wrist, something cold and sharp flashed through her, chilling her resolve into something unbreakable. She withdrew her hand with a polite smile that hid the tremor in her fingertips, telling herself she would endure this moment only long enough to find a way out. Later, after an hour of thinly veiled negotiations and her father's humiliating gratitude, Redcliffe departed with a self-satisfied stride, pausing at the door to claim he eagerly awaited their next meeting. Helena stood in the entryway long after the carriage rolled out of sight, the morning air brushing her cheeks like a warning. She understood now that silence would not save her, obedience would not shield her, and endurance would not buy her freedom. She would have to choose a different path, even if every step of it led her into danger. Helena escaped to London under the guise of wedding preparations, though the journey felt less like an errand and more like a stolen breath before drowning. Her father insisted she visit dressmakers and jewelers, but Helena arranged her hours with quiet precision, carving out a single sliver of freedom in the middle of the day by dismissing her chaperone for a short rest and slipping into the nearest sanctuary she could find, the old lending library on Brook Street, where the smell of leather and ink wrapped around her like a balm. She moved among the shelves with the reverence of someone greeting old friends, fingers trailing over familiar spines, her pulse finally starting to calm after the suffocating morning she'd endured with Redcliffe's letters and lists of bridal obligations. She reached up for a worn volume of essays, one she had loved as a girl, only to find it maddeningly out of reach, and as she rose onto her toes, a deeper voice behind her said, "Allow me," warm and unhurried, with a hint of restrained charm. A tall man stepped beside her, gloved hand lifting the book with the ease of someone accustomed to helping without fanfare. He was dark-haired, sharply dressed, and carried an air of quiet authority that seemed to ripple through the dusty sunlight. When he handed her the volume, she caught the fleeting impression of steady grey eyes that missed nothing and judged less than she expected. Helena thanked him with a small nod, meant to discourage further conversation, yet something in his gaze, an unexpected gentleness, perhaps, made her linger when he asked whether she favored essays over novels, a harmless question that somehow slipped past her defenses. She found herself admitting that she read both, depending on whether she needed escape or clarity, and to her astonishment, the stranger did not laugh, dismiss, or condescend. Instead, he replied that escape could itself be a form of clarity if one chose the right story, and they stood there in the filtered light, trading observations about literature, obligation, and the maddening expectations of society. She spoke more freely than she should have, confessing that life lately felt like a series of expectations she never agreed to, and though she stopped herself before saying more, the man's expression softened with unmistakable understanding, as if he sensed her unspoken fear. When her chaperone reappeared in a flustered rush, Helena stepped back, cheeks warming as she attempted to gather her composure. She asked the man's name, but he only bowed with quiet humility and said, "A friend of the written word, nothing more," before departing with a lingering glance that unsettled her in a way she could not name. Hours later, as Helena sat in her carriage returning to her lodging, she felt that strange encounter echo through her, a sliver of light in an otherwise darkening world. She did not yet know that the man who handed her the book was Baron Ravensmere, the Duke, the very Duke, whose life would soon collide with hers in a way neither of them could have foreseen, his curiosity already sharpening as he learned that the woman he met in the library was the one destined to marry Baron Redcliff. London society devoured news of Helena's engagement, the way wolves descend upon a fresh carcass, each drawing room adding its own flavor of embellishment until the truth lay buried beneath layers of silk-gloved cruelty. What began as a quiet announcement issued by Lord Ashbury quickly transformed into a spectacle, with matrons remarking that Helena was fortunate indeed to secure such a match given her family's precarious finances, and younger ladies whispering behind fluttering fans that desperation must have played a role, for no woman willingly chose a man like Baron Redcliff unless forced by circumstance. Helena heard these murmurs first at the dressmaker's, where two society wives, unaware she stood behind the velvet curtain, speculated that she ought to be grateful. Anyone wanted her at all now that Ashbury coffers were all but dry. The words stung like nettles pressed against her skin, yet she kept herself utterly still, her breath tight in her chest as she realized they were not trying to wound her specifically. They simply saw her as a character in a story that amused them. Later, at a milliner's shop, she overheard a debutante remark that Helena must be relieved to escape the burden of managing a failing estate, as though Helena were a helpless ornament rather than a woman who had spent years quietly relieving her father of responsibilities he neglected. Even the servants in her London lodging traded whispers in the hallway at night, wondering if the Baron's sudden generosity meant he had something to prove, and Helena lay awake listening to their voices tremble through the walls like cold wind through a half-shuttered window. It was not the gossip itself that threatened to break her. It was the realization that she was becoming a story others told, her voice swallowed by narratives designed to excuse Redcliff's possessiveness and justify her father's betrayal. Meanwhile, Adrian Ravensmere found himself cornered in the hushed cigar smoke of his gentleman's club, as fellow members congratulated Redcliffe on securing a bride, with fine breeding, if not fine fortune, their laughter thick with implication. Adrian, who usually ignored gossip with the ease of a man who had long ceased caring about society's petty games, felt a coldness coil beneath his ribs as he listened. Redcliffe boasted that Helena was pliable enough once one knows how to handle her, and the smug satisfaction in the Baron's tone struck Adrian with unexpected violence. Later that evening, he summoned a discreet inquiry into the Ashbury family, learning of their near ruin, the debts, the suddenness of the engagement, and the subtle pressure that seemed to shadow every detail. Each discovery only sharpened Adrian's unease until it settled into something dangerously close to anger. He remembered Helena's quiet grace in the library, the sorrow she tried to hide behind polite conversation, and he understood now that she had been carrying far more than she dared reveal. As rumors continued to swell, Helena moved through parlors and shops with her head held high, yet the world seemed intent on binding her into the role of a grateful, helpless bride, while Adrian, haunted by the memory of her steady eyes, found himself thinking that perhaps, for the first time in years, he might be compelled to intervene in a matter that was none of his business, and yet felt entirely like his responsibility. The masked ball at the Harringtons' estate glittered like a jeweled dream, its grand halls spilling over with candlelight, music, and the rustle of silk gowns that shimmered like moonlit water. Yet for Helena, it felt less like a celebration and more like a brief illusion of freedom, one night where anonymity might allow her to breathe without feeling the invisible chain of her engagement dragging behind her. She entered draped in pale gold satin, her face hidden behind an intricately beaded mask that turned her features into something mysterious and untouchable, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest whisper of escape as she slipped into the crowd. The ballroom swirled around her, masked couples spinning under chandeliers, laughter rising like smoke, the orchestra sweeping through a waltz that made even the walls seem to sway, but Helena remained on the fringes, watching, trying to forget how little of her life belonged to her now. She was turning toward the refreshment table when a tall, masked gentleman stepped into her path, his presence striking not for extravagance but for an air of quiet certainty, as though storms bent around him rather than through him. "May I have this dance?" he asked, the deep timbre of his voice sending a soft tremor along her spine, and though propriety urged caution, something in the gentle command of his tone nudged her to place her hand in his. The moment his gloved fingers closed around hers, a calm she had not felt in months settled over her like a warm cloak. They moved into the waltz with a natural, effortless harmony that startled her. She had danced with several gentlemen before, but never with someone whose touch guided without claiming, whose steps matched hers with intuitive ease. The anonymity emboldened her, loosening the knots inside her chest, and when he murmured, "You look as though the world has asked too much of you lately," the words hit so close to truth that her breath caught. She replied cautiously at first, giving vague hints of burdens she could not name, but the stranger's quiet attentiveness, his refusal to fill silences with empty chatter, pulled more honesty from her than she intended, and soon she was confessing that she felt trapped in a life shaped by decisions not her own. He did not ask for explanations or press for details. Instead, he said, "Some cages are built so beautifully that one forgets they're cruel," a line that made Helena's heart twist. For several minutes they drifted through the ballroom as though suspended outside of time, exchanging fragments of truth that felt safer behind their masks than they ever would in daylight. When the unmasking came near midnight, she hesitated a moment before lifting her beaded disguise, only to freeze when the gentleman revealed himself, Adrian Ravensmere, the Duke she had glimpsed across rooms but never truly met until that day in the library. Shock rippled through her, mingling with something far more dangerous, a hope that frightened her with its intensity. Adrian looked at her with a steadiness that stole her breath, his expression a blend of recognition and renewed resolve, as though the pieces of a puzzle he had not known he was assembling had suddenly fallen into place. And as the orchestra resumed, Helena realized with a quiet shiver that the one man who truly saw her was also the one man she could not afford to want. The fragile sense of possibility Helena had tasted at the masked ball shattered only days later, replaced by a cold dread that settled in her bones when Baron Redcliff arrived at Ashbury Hall unannounced, sweeping through the front doors as though he already owned every stone, every servant, every breath within its walls. Helena was in the music room, attempting to distract her sister with a halting duet, when the butler appeared in the doorway with an apologetic bow and murmured, "My lady, the Baron insists on seeing you. Alone." A tremor rippled through her, but she squared her shoulders and followed the Baron into a narrow side corridor. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, his veneer cracked. The polite smile fell from his face like peeling varnish, replaced with a glint of cold satisfaction. "You have been rather visible lately," he said, stepping closer with a slowness that made her stomach twist, "and not in ways that please me." Before she could retreat, his hand shot out and clamped around her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to bruise. "A duke paying you attention," he hissed, "makes you look like a woman who cannot keep her place. It makes me look like a man who cannot control what is already his." Helena froze, her breath caught somewhere between fury and fear. She tried to pull her arm free, but Redcliff's grip only tightened, sending a jolt of pain up her forearm. "My behavior," she said through clenched teeth, "is not yours to command." His smile sharpened, a cruel parody of amusement. "Everything about you is mine to command. Your father signed a contract, and I intend to collect every benefit it promises. If you embarrass me again, my dear, the consequences will not fall on you alone." Ashbury debt is a delicate thing, easily called in. Her heart lurched painfully as he leaned close enough for her to smell the cloying sweetness of his cologne, every word a threat wrapped in velvet. Images of her father's trembling hands, her sister's pale face, the frightened looks of their staff, all of it flashed through her, twisting fear into a fierce, trembling rage. "Release me," she whispered, her voice dangerously steady. For the briefest moment, Redcliff actually paused, startled by something new in her tone. But then he dropped her wrist with a dismissive flick of his fingers, as though she were an object he had inspected and found duller than expected. "Do not mistake this for freedom," he said. "It is merely patience. For now." Helena walked away before he could see her shaking, slipping into an empty parlor and bracing her hands against the piano to steady herself as hot, helpless tears threatened. She forced them back. Tears solved nothing. What terrified her most was not Redcliff's cruelty, but how easily he assumed she was powerless. Later, at a crowded afternoon gathering, she caught Adrian Ravensmere watching her from across the room, his gaze darkening as it landed on the faint bruises blooming beneath her glove. She quickly looked away, but not quickly enough to hide the truth. Adrian's expression changed, not to shock, nor even anger, but to something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. In that instant, Helena realized two things at once. Redcliff would never loosen his grip willingly, and Adrian Ravensmere had just quietly, irrevocably decided that the wedding would never happen at all. Helena did not intend to see Adrian Ravensmere again so soon, yet fate, or perhaps his own quiet determination, brought him to her the very next morning under the thin pretext of returning a book he claimed she had left behind at the lending library, though she knew with a single glance at his composed face that he had come for reasons far heavier than misplaced literature. The butler announced him with the kind of reverence reserved for royalty, and Helena, who had been nursing her bruised wrist in the dim corner of the garden terrace, felt her breath snag as the Duke stepped into the pale sunlight, with the controlled grace of a man fighting the urge to break something, or someone, on her behalf. He did not immediately approach. Instead, he watched her for a moment with a gaze so steady it felt like a hand extended toward her without touching. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, each word carefully measured. "Lady Helena, may I trouble you for a moment's privacy?" She hesitated, aware of propriety, of watching servants, of how easily a simple conversation could ignite further scandal. Yet the memory of Redcliff's grip on her wrist pulsed beneath her glove like a silent plea. She nodded, allowing Adrian to lead her along the garden path, where the hedges grew tall enough to shield them from curious eyes. The air smelled faintly of lavender and damp stone, a softness at odds with the storm gathering inside her chest. Adrian stopped beneath the arched branches of an ancient oak, his jaw taut, his hands clasped behind his back as though restraining the impulse to reach for her. "I saw your injury yesterday," he said quietly, not accusing, not pitying, simply stating a truth neither of them could ignore. Helena's throat tightened, and she instinctively tucked her hand closer to her side, but Adrian's gaze remained gentle, never invasive. "You owe me no explanation," he continued, "but I want you to know that what was done to you is neither acceptable nor legal. There are avenues we may pursue." The word we seeped into her like warmth, frightening in its promise yet impossible to reject. She forced herself to meet his eyes, seeing in them not the cold detachment society claimed he possessed, but something steadier, fiercer, a controlled outrage wrapped in discipline. "There is nothing to be done," she whispered, the admission tasting both bitter and liberating. "My father is indebted beyond reason. Redcliffe knows it. He holds every advantage." Adrian stepped closer, so close she could feel the faint heat radiating from him, though he did not touch her. "Then let us tip the balance," he murmured. "My solicitor is already reviewing the contract your father signed. There may be flaws, loopholes, clauses that require your full, uncoerced consent." Helena's breath faltered, hope flickering like a candle in a draught. "You would risk your name, your standing for this?" she asked, genuinely unable to fathom what she had done to earn such protection. Adrian's expression softened, the hard lines around his mouth easing. "For you," he said, the simple honesty of the words striking her harder than any grand declaration. "And because some things are wrong enough to demand intervention, title or no." Silence stretched between them, not awkward but charged, a delicate thread tying them together in the quiet shade of the oak. Helena swallowed, her voice barely more than a breath. "Then yes, I will listen, and I will fight." His answering nod was small, solemn, and utterly resolute. In that moment, their alliance was forged, not of flirtation or desperation, but of shared resolve, and Helena felt, for the first time, that her fate might no longer be written entirely by the hands of men who sought to own her. Here, in the filtered morning light, she had found someone who wished to help her rewrite it. Adrian's solicitor, a thin, exacting man named Mr. Harland, whose spectacles perpetually slid down the bridge of his nose, arrived at Ashbury Hall under the guise of delivering estate documents, though in truth he carried something far heavier than ledgers. Helena waited in the small morning room, hands folded in her lap, her pulse an anxious flutter beneath her gown's fitted bodice, as Adrian entered beside Harland, with the air of a man bracing himself for impact. The solicitor bowed politely before laying out a stack of papers on the table between them, each sheet a stark testament to her father's ruin. The first pages were tolerable enough: debts, wages lost, obligations unmet. But as Harland turned to the grave heart of the matter, Helena felt the room shrink around her. Her father's signature appeared again and again, scrawled across agreements that bound not only money but future promises, culminating in the engagement contract with Baron Redcliff, written in language stripped of warmth or humanity. Helena watched as Harland traced a narrow finger along the clauses: financial obligations, transfer of dowry assets, marital expectations, and buried near the bottom, the most damning line of all, the acknowledgement that her betrothal represented adequate recompense for the Baron's financial intervention. Adequate recompense, a phrase so clinical it sliced through her like a cold blade. She clenched her jaw to hold steady, forcing breath into her lungs as she absorbed the full ugliness of what her father had agreed to. For a moment she felt suspended, as though she was studying someone else's ruin from afar. But then Harland spoke gently, explaining that while the contract was formidable, it was not airtight. That single, quietly powerful clause requiring her willing consent at the time of the ceremony, previously dismissed as ceremonial nicety, could become their strongest weapon. Adrian watched her in silence while she digested this, his posture rigid, the tension in his shoulders betraying restraint. He did not speak for several minutes, allowing her the dignity of absorbing the truth before offering comfort. It was a mercy she had not expected from anyone, least of all a duke. Helena straightened, pushing aside the haze of humiliation to focus on every detail Harland revealed, refusing to let her own shame eclipse the need for clarity. She asked questions, dozens of them, her voice steady even as her hands trembled beneath the table. How binding were the financial terms? Could Redcliffe retaliate? What would become of Ashbury if the Baron withdrew support entirely? Harland answered with calm precision, and with each exchange Helena felt a new, steely thread weaving itself through her spine. She had been treated as a passive object in this saga, but here, now, she reclaimed a portion of her agency simply by demanding knowledge that had been kept from her. When the solicitor finally gathered his documents, Adrian stepped forward, his voice quiet but weighted with conviction. "You are not alone in this," he told her, and though the words were simple, they struck her with unexpected force. She met his gaze, cool grey coloured by something gentler, and understood that he admired not just her predicament but her resolve. And in that moment, as afternoon light warmed the edges of the room, Helena felt the first true shift in her fate. Not because her father's sins were undone, nor because rescue had arrived, but because she was beginning to choose, actively, fiercely, to fight. Helena had imagined a dozen versions of confronting her father, each one sharp-edged and powerful, but when she finally stepped into his study that evening, the reality ached far more than any rehearsed fury could have prepared her for. The room smelled of stale brandy and extinguished dreams, heavy drapes filtering the dying light into a muted amber gloom where dust motes drifted like tiny ghosts. Lord Ashbury sat hunched at his desk, rubbing his temples with trembling fingers, the ink of yet another unsigned promissory note staining his thumb. He looked up at her with a fragile, desperate smile that made her heart twist painfully, not with sympathy, but with the grief of seeing the father she had adored reduced to this wretched silhouette of a man. "My dear girl," he said, attempting cheer that cracked with strain, "did Redcliffe treat you well today? He is a generous man, far more than we deserve." Helena shut the door behind her, the soft click sounding like the closing of a gate she could never reopen. She moved slowly toward him, feeling as though each step carried years of unspoken truths. "Father," she began, carefully controlling the tremor in her voice, "why did you not tell me what you had done?" He blinked, feigning confusion, but she pressed on, her words gaining strength. "Why did you sign a contract that trades my future, my life, for your debts?" His face crumpled, shame flooding through his features as he sagged back in his chair. "Helena, you don't understand. I had no choice. Redcliffe was the only one willing to help us. The estate is drowning. Your sister, our staff, everything hangs by a thread." Each excuse landed like a blow. She clenched her hands at her sides, nails digging into her palms. "So you offered me as a thread for him to pull?" she whispered. "Did you consider asking me? Did you think I would not have tried to help you find some other way?" Her father's gaze skittered away, unable to face the raw hurt in hers. "I thought," he swallowed, shattering, "I thought you would forgive me." Those words cracked something inside her, not with anger, but with the quiet collapse of trust she had clung to longer than reason allowed. For several long moments she stood absolutely still, breathing against the ache in her chest until her pulse steadied. Then she spoke, each word crystalline and painfully clear. "I will not let my sister pay for this mistake. I will not let our tenants suffer for it. But I will also not sacrifice myself to a man who sees me as property. Whatever happens next, it will not be decided by the terms Redcliffe forced upon you." Lord Ashbury's lips parted. Whether to beg her forgiveness or plead his case she could not tell, because a soft shift in the doorway drew her attention. Adrian stood there, half in shadow, his expression unreadable but his eyes ablaze with quiet respect. Helena straightened, meeting his gaze with a new steadiness she had not possessed a week ago. She was no longer merely her father's daughter or Redcliffe's intended. She was a woman who had just drawn a line through the wreckage of her past and chosen to stand on her own side of it. The first sign that Baron Redcliffe had sensed the shifting tide was the sudden, strategic sweetness of society's smiles, an omen Helena recognized only after it was too late to pretend ignorance. Gossip moved through London like a chill wind, invisible but biting, and within days the whispers about her engagement transformed from idle speculation into carefully planted narratives. At a tea hosted by Lady Whittaker, Helena felt the shift as surely as if someone had drawn a dagger across the silk of her gown. Women who had never shown her the slightest interest now approached with syrupy sympathy, remarking that they had heard she'd been under tremendous strain, or that wedding nerves can make a young lady terribly fragile, their eyes glinting with the satisfaction of being in possession of a rumor freshly minted. Others leaned in a little too close, voices dipped in false concern as they asked if she was sleeping well, if she was feeling overwhelmed, if she had perhaps grown confused by too much outside attention, thinly veiled references to Adrian that made her spine stiffen. The most cutting remark came from Lady Pembroke, who patted Helena's hand and cooed, "My dear, Baron Redcliffe is doing you such a kindness. A girl in your family's situation cannot afford to be selective." The words sliced through Helena's composure, but she forced a serene smile, refusing to give these women the satisfaction of provoking her. By evening, the whispers had taken on a new shape, that Helena was unstable, ungrateful, even willful, as though she were a child acting out rather than a woman trapped in a bargain she had never chosen. And Redcliffe, she realized with dawning horror, was the architect of it all. Every rumor excused his tightening grip. Every sympathetic murmur painted her as the problem. It was a slow, deliberate strangling of her voice before she even had the chance to raise it. Meanwhile, Adrian, moving through the same circles with a quiet awareness that belied his outward calm, heard the whispers with growing fury. A gentleman at his club clapped him on the shoulder one afternoon and said, half laughing, "Ravensmere, you have quite the effect on fragile young ladies. Poor Miss Ashbury seems a bit adrift." Adrian's response was a shade too cold, his polite smile too controlled, and the man quickly retreated, sensing danger lurking beneath the surface. Adrian spent the next hours gathering information with the precision of a man accustomed to strategy. Every snide comment, every insinuation, every mention of Helena's supposed instability only confirmed what his instincts had already warned him. Redcliffe was laying the groundwork to paint Helena as irrational should she ever attempt to resist. That night, Adrian stood at the window of his study, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the dark as the magnitude of the situation settled heavily across his shoulders. To save Helena, he realized, he would have to do more than uncover the truth of her father's debts. He would have to dismantle Redcliffe's narrative, protect her reputation, and risk his own with each step. For a man who had spent years guarding his name with the precision of a soldier guarding a fortress, the decision should have been agonizing. Yet as he thought of Helena, of her grit, her dignity, the quiet fury she carried beneath her calm, his resolve hardened. If society insisted on turning her into a scandal, then he would become one as well, and together they would burn through every whisper Redcliffe had planted. The plan Adrian proposed to Helena a few days later was so audacious, so improper, that for several heartbeats she could only stare at him beneath the shade of the garden's ancient elm, feeling the world tilt as his words settled like forbidden sparks in the air. They had met under the polite excuse of delivering estate documents, an excuse thin enough to be transparent, yet acceptable enough that no servant dared question it, and Helena had expected further discussion of legal strategies or debts. Instead, Adrian spoke with a level calm that belied the risk in every syllable. "Redcliffe is shaping a story," he said, hands clasped behind him, gaze steady. "He paints you as unstable, so that any resistance can be dismissed as hysteria. To counter him, we must craft a story of our own." She swallowed, unsure she wanted to hear more, yet unable to look away from the quiet fire in his eyes. "What story?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Adrian drew a breath. "A duke pursuing a lady is always a spectacle. If society sees me showing you clear, unmistakable attention, respectful, public, intentional, then Redcliffe's possessiveness begins to look less like concern and more like insecurity. His version of events weakens, yours strengthens." The world seemed to narrow around her, the rustle of leaves fading as her pulse thundered. "You are suggesting," she managed, "that we stage a courtship?" Adrian's expression did not waver. "Yes, not a scandalous one, not improper, simply visible." She nearly laughed at the absurdity of it, at the image of herself walking through London gardens with a duke while technically betrothed to another man. A reckless, dangerous idea. And yet, she remembered Redcliffe's grip on her wrist, the rumors curdling around her like fog, the shrinking sense that every avenue of escape was closing. "This could ruin you," she whispered. "People will say you are interfering." "They already say it," Adrian replied softly, "and I am not in the habit of allowing bullies to define my conduct." Something hot and fragile tightened in her chest at that. She turned away, trying to collect the scattered pieces of her composure, but Adrian stepped closer, not touching, never touching, yet his presence brushed against her like a vow. "If this is too great a risk," he said, "we will find another path. I will not pressure you." That gentleness, his refusal to claim, command, or coerce, struck her harder than any declaration could. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to him. "No," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "If this is the only way to protect the truth, then, yes, I agree." What followed moved with strange, breathless swiftness. Their first public interaction occurred at the Kensington Greenhouse exhibition, where Adrian approached her with exquisite formality, bowing just deeply enough to ensure every curious eye noticed. He asked after her health with such warmth that a nearby matron nearly dropped her fan. Later, at a musicale, he arranged to take the seat beside her and spent the evening exchanging quiet observations that made her smile despite herself. Each shared glance, building a dangerous familiarity neither of them acknowledged aloud. And though it was all meant to be staged, Helena felt the boundaries blur with alarming ease. When Adrian offered his arm during a garden stroll at Vauxhall, her heartbeat quickened not from pretense, but from the soft brush of his sleeve against her gloves. Society, predictably, erupted, not in condemnation, but fascination. Redcliffe bristled. Helena breathed a little easier. Adrian remained inscrutable to all but her, though she sensed the tension coiling beneath his calm like a storm restrained. And in that delicate balance between strategy and longing, something new began to take root, not an illusion of courtship, but the first trembling outline of something dangerously real. In the weeks that followed their first deliberate public appearances, Helena discovered that what began as strategy soon slipped into something far more intimate, threading itself through her days in ways she could neither ignore nor entirely resist. Each sanctioned moment with Adrian, each stroll along a promenade, each conversation shared across a crowded drawing room, each brief brush of gloved hands as they examined a watercolor or a botanical sketch, became a quiet lesson in defiance, in self-worth, in the possibility of a life shaped by her own choosing rather than by a contract written in desperation. It startled her, how easily he coaxed truth from her, how naturally her guarded thoughts spilled into the spaces between them. During a carriage ride arranged under the polite excuse of discussing charity events, he asked her what she would do if she were not bound by expectation or obligation. She laughed softly, attempting to deflect with something practiced and proper. But he only waited, patient as moonlight, and so, inch by inch, she allowed the truth to slip free. She confessed that she loved books not simply for story, but for structure, that she adored ledgers and accounts, not because society expected her to, but because numbers, unlike people, did not lie. She admitted she wished to oversee Ashbury's tenant farms herself to ensure families were treated fairly, dreams she had never dared speak aloud because they would have been dismissed as delusions of a sheltered girl. Adrian's expression had softened, the lines of his face gentling as though he were memorizing each fragile word. "You would be remarkable at it," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice settled into her bones like warmth. In return, he revealed pieces of himself she suspected few ever saw. He spoke of the crushing expectation placed upon him since childhood, the relentless demand that a duke must be impenetrable, composed, unshakable, as if his very humanity were an inconvenience. He admitted that he sometimes envied ordinary men allowed to make mistakes without those mistakes being immortalized in gossip columns or parliamentary whispers. Helena listened, struck by the depth beneath his quiet exterior, by the burden he carried with such grace. She found herself watching the small shifts in his expression, the faint crease between his brows when he was troubled, the fleeting lift at the corner of his mouth when something amused him, the way he glanced at her hands when he thought she wasn't looking, as though ensuring she bore no new bruises. Their conversations filled the empty spaces in her days with a kind of tenderness she had never known, weaving an emotional tapestry so complex and delicate that she feared touching any single thread might unravel it entirely. Yet for all the quiet intimacy forming between them, neither spoke of feelings. They did not need to. Helena felt it in the way Adrian's voice softened when he said her name, and Adrian felt it in the way Helena's eyes warmed when she looked at him, small, dangerous truths simmering beneath every polite exchange. And though the world saw only a duke interfering in another man's engagement, Helena knew better. What sparked between them was not scandal. It was recognition. It was solace. It was the early tremor of something deeper, something that frightened her with its intensity, yet strengthened her with every passing moment. The veneer of safety Helena had begun to feel, fragile, precious, built delicately through stolen conversations and carefully orchestrated public scenes, shattered in a heartbeat on the night Redcliffe revealed the true depth of his cruelty. It happened at a dinner hosted by the Harringtons, a glittering affair meant to celebrate the turning of the season, where Helena found herself pinned between polite obligations and the suffocating tension of knowing Redcliffe's eyes were on her across the room. She had arrived on Adrian's arm, respectfully, publicly, properly, yet fully aware that every step she took, every smile she offered, every polite gesture she made was being catalogued by a man who believed her, his possession. Helena tried to ignore it, focusing on light conversation with Lady Hartwell and keeping her breathing steady, but she could feel Redcliffe watching her with the simmering fury of someone who sees his control slipping grain by grain through clenched fists. Near the end of the evening, as candles guttered low and musicians shifted into a final, haunting melody, Helena excused herself to retrieve her shawl from the corridor. She had barely taken 2 steps into the dim passageway before a hand shot out of the shadows and seized her, dragging her into a narrow alcove between towering marble columns. She gasped, instinctively fighting back, but Redcliff's fingers clamped around her upper arm with bruising force. "What do you think you are doing?" he hissed, his breath sour with wine and fury. Helena struggled, lifting her chin despite the panic clawing up her throat. "I am doing nothing improper." "Nothing improper?" His laugh was low, vicious. "You make a spectacle of yourself on a duke's arm while you are promised to me." He squeezed harder, pain lancing through her shoulder. "Do you enjoy humiliating me, Helena? Do you think you may parade yourself before all of London and suffer no consequence?" She swallowed hard, fear and anger tangling painfully in her chest. "You have no right to put your hands on me," she whispered, refusing to let her voice tremble. Redcliffe leaned closer until his nose nearly brushed hers, his expression twisting into something venomous. "Everything I do is my right. You were bought, and I intend to collect what is owed." Helena felt the blood drain from her face. "If you attempt to interfere again," he continued, voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "your father will be dragged through the courts and your sister ruined. Do not forget who holds the power." Her heart thundered in her ears, but something inside her, something Adrian had helped her rediscover, rose in quiet rebellion. She lifted her chin, meeting Redcliffe's twisted gaze with a steadiness that made him recoil for the briefest instant. "I will fulfill only what my conscience allows," she said softly, "and I will not be threatened into silence." He released her with a violent jerk, shoving her back as though disgusted by her refusal. Helena steadied herself against the column, forcing her breath into some semblance of rhythm. When she stepped back into the golden light of the ballroom, she schooled her expression into calm perfection, but Adrian saw her instantly. His eyes dropped to the stark marks blooming under her sleeve, before rising to meet her gaze with an expression she had never seen before, not just anger, but a cold, razor-edged fury sharpened by protectiveness. In that moment, Helena understood 2 truths with blinding clarity. Redcliffe would stop at nothing to break her, and Adrian Ravensmere, quiet and controlled as he appeared, would stop at nothing to save her. The next morning, a thin veil of mist clung to the Ashbury grounds as Helena paced the length of the small morning room, her bruised arm hidden beneath long sleeves, her thoughts a restless storm of fear and resolve. She had barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt Redcliffe's fingers biting into her skin, heard his voice dripping venom, saw the ugly certainty that he believed himself untouchable. But worse, far worse, was the knowledge that his power extended far beyond her own fate. If she married him, Ashbury's tenants, the villagers, the families whose livelihoods depended on the estate would become pawns in his schemes. That truth pierced deeper than any fear for herself, carving a cold clarity through her worry. Adrian arrived just past mid-morning with Mr. Harland, the solicitor, both men wearing expressions carved from granite. Helena motioned for them to sit, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. It felt surreal to conduct something so civilized when her world was quietly collapsing. Adrian did not speak for several moments, simply watching her with that steady, unreadable intensity that always made her feel both exposed and protected. "Finally," he said softly, "Harland has found something." The solicitor cleared his throat before laying out yet another set of documents, this time not detailing Helena's father's debts, but Redcliffe's ambitions. Helena leaned in, heart thudding, as Harland explained that the Baron intended to use Ashbury lands as collateral for a web of speculative investments and predatory contracts. He showed her notes describing increased rents, forced evictions for families who fell behind, and an insidious arrangement with a private syndicate known for swallowing old estates whole. Helena's stomach churned as each sheet revealed a fresh cruelty. He had planned to use her marriage not just to claim her, but to seize everything and everyone she held dear. "He means to strip the land," Harland said quietly, "and once he begins, nothing short of ruin will stop him." For a moment Helena could not breathe. The thought of her tenants, Mrs. Wren with her arthritic hands, the Harper children who ran barefoot through the orchards, old Mr. Fletcher who had worked the estate since her grandfather's time, being cast out like refuse, ignited something fierce within her chest. She pressed her palm against her sternum, grounding herself as anger flared through her like fire across kindling. "I would be the instrument of their suffering," she whispered, horror threading through her words. "If I marry him, I become the cause." Adrian stepped forward then, unable to restrain himself, the veneer of duke-like composure cracking just enough for her to see the raw determination beneath. "You will not," he said, voice low and firm. "Not while I draw breath." His certainty steadied her, a lifeline woven of steel and something softer, something that made her pulse quicken. Helena lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with newfound resolve. "Then we fight," she said. She expected fear to follow the declaration, but none came. Only clarity, only strength. And in that moment Adrian looked at her with something like awe, as though he were witnessing not a fragile lady trapped by duty but a woman stepping fully into the fire without flinching. The war for her freedom, and her family's future, had officially begun. The conservatory had always been Helena's refuge, a sanctuary of warm air and roses, even in the bleakness of late autumn. Yet that evening it felt different, charged, fragile, trembling with unsaid things as she stepped inside and found Adrian already waiting among the lantern-lit vines. The light gilded him in gold and shadow, highlighting the tension in his shoulders, the controlled stillness of a man fighting battles on too many fronts. The moment their eyes met, something in her chest shifted, an ache, a yearning, a terrifying awareness of the man he had quietly become to her. She hesitated near the doorway, fingers curling around the silk of her skirts, as if bracing herself. "You wish to speak with me," she said softly, though the air between them already felt thick with what neither had yet admitted. Adrian turned toward her with a slowness that stole her breath, as though he had been prepared to wait all night for her. "I did," he answered, his voice low, threaded with a restraint that hummed like a violin string pulled taut. "I wanted to ensure you were not burdened beyond endurance." It was a simple statement, yet something in his tone made her body go still. He was not asking after her well-being as a duke should. He was asking as a man who feared for her, who wanted to shoulder her pain, who had begun, perhaps without meaning to let affection slip through the cracks in his armor. Helena moved closer, the faint scent of roses curling around her as she stepped into the warm glow of lantern light. "I am holding," she murmured, though the bruise beneath her sleeve throbbed in reminder. "Redcliff cannot break me, not anymore." Adrian's jaw tightened, a flicker of raw emotion crossing his composed features. "He should never have touched you," he said, voice roughened, as though the words scraped him from the inside. "And the fact that he believes he has any claim." He cut himself off, exhaling sharply, fighting the fury that threatened to spill free. Helena's heart twisted at the sight. For so long she had carried her struggles in silence, believing no one saw her suffering. But Adrian saw. He saw everything. She took another step, breath trembling. "You are not responsible for my pain," she whispered, the admission escaping before she could temper it. "I do not wish you to feel accountable for my father's choices, or Redcliff's cruelty." Adrian's gaze dropped to her hands, lingering on the faint tremor she could not quite hide. "Perhaps not accountable," he said quietly. "But I am, invested, more than I should be." The confession hung between them, soft yet shattering, and Helena felt her pulse stutter, her composure falter. Words rose in her throat, dangerous, tender, frightening words she had kept locked behind bone and caution. She wanted to tell him that he had changed her life, that his belief in her had built a courage she never knew she possessed, that he had slipped beneath her defenses and settled somewhere she could no longer ignore. Her heart surged to her lips. "Adrian," she breathed, the name tasting like something illicit, something precious. For a moment his eyes closed, as if steadying himself against the truth pulsing between them. When he opened them again, they burned with emotion too intense to hide. But then, slowly, painfully, he stepped back a fraction, not away from her, but away from what he feared he might take without right. "Helena," he said, voice roughened, "I cannot, will not, speak the words I want to speak, not while you are bound to another, even in contract alone. You deserve freedom, before you deserve confession." It hurt, that restraint. It hurt, and yet it made her love him more fiercely than she dared admit. She lifted her chin, steadying her breath. "Then when I am free," she whispered, "I hope you will still be waiting." Adrian's expression softened with something like awe, something like longing. "I will try," he murmured. "But for you, Helena, waiting might be the least difficult thing I have ever done." The conservatory fell silent then, filled only with the scent of roses and the echo of all they could not yet say. The confrontation came sooner than Adrian expected, and far more directly. He had been reviewing estate correspondence in the quiet of his gentleman's club, an austere room of dark wood, muted conversation, and men who prized reputation above integrity. When Baron Redcliff approached with the oily confidence of someone who believed himself feared, Adrian did not rise. He merely looked up, expression cool, as Redcliffe lowered himself into the chair opposite with the casual arrogance of a man claiming ground not his own. "Your Grace," the Baron drawled, swirling brandy in his glass, "we must speak plainly." Adrian waited, giving nothing away. Redcliffe leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You have been far too attentive to my fiancée." Adrian's jaw flexed, but he remained silent. "I understand admiration," Redcliffe continued, "but admiration becomes interference when a man of your standing begins to weaken a lady's resolve." He sipped his drink, smirking. "It places us all in an awkward position." Adrian's voice, when he finally spoke, was a blade sheathed in velvet. "The only awkwardness arises from your assumption that Lady Helena's will is something for men to barter." Redcliffe's smile curdled, but he pressed on. "Let us not pretend, Your Grace. Her family's survival hinges on our agreement. If you withdraw your attentions, public and private, I am willing to forgive a portion of Lord Ashbury's debts. A generous offer, one that spares all parties unnecessary scandal." His meaning was unmistakable. Abandon Helena, and the Baron would graciously restore order. Adrian felt something cold and precise settle in his chest, a fury quieter than fire, deadlier too. "I do not negotiate with men who harm women," he said, voice low and lethal. "Nor do I bow to threats dressed as favors." Redcliffe stiffened, caught off guard. Adrian leaned in, eyes hard. "If you continue to raise your hand or your voice against her, you will answer for it, publicly." Redcliffe stood abruptly, composure cracking for a heartbeat. "You risk far too much for a woman who cannot be yours," he spat. Adrian rose too, slowly, with the unhurried confidence of a man who rarely needed to raise his voice to end a confrontation. "You are mistaken," he said, his gaze cutting through the Baron's bluster. "She is not a thing to be owned, and she is certainly not yours." Redcliffe faltered, the words landing with more weight than he expected, before he forced a mocking bow and stalked away. Later that afternoon, Helena learned of the exchange, not from gossip, but from the Baron's own foolish boasting, his attempt to paint the Duke as desperate. The news struck her like a blow, though not for the reasons society might claim. She stood at her bedroom window, staring out across the frost-kissed lawns, fingers pressed lightly to the glass, as her heart trembled with a complex, overwhelming ache. Adrian had risked, not just disapproval or whispers, but his entire reputation, his standing, his name, for her, not to possess her, not to win her, but simply to shield her, to defend what little freedom she had left. Gratitude swelled into something warmer, fiercer, frightening in its intensity. She pressed her palm to her chest, steadying the rapid beat beneath. Until now she had believed herself fighting alone, against Redcliffe, against society, against the crushing weight of expectation, but she was no longer alone. Adrian Ravensmere had stepped willingly into the storm alongside her, and in doing so he had shifted the balance of her world. She felt it with every breath. Whatever happened next, her fate was no longer a cage tightening around her. It was a door being pried open, slowly, carefully, by the hands of a man who refused to let her fall. By the time a fortnight had passed, Helena could feel the weight of London's collective gaze pressing against her skin like an unwelcome touch. Every parlour and promenade transformed into a stage upon which she and Adrian were studied with breathless fascination, whispered judgment, and thinly veiled envy. What began as a deliberate tactic, a careful, measured display of the Duke's attention meant to counter Redcliffe's manipulations, had spiraled into the Tun's newest obsession. Women leaned together, fans fluttering like restless wings, speculating whether Helena had always harbored ambitions of enchanting a duke, or whether Adrian, aloof and unreachable for so many seasons, had finally succumbed to the allure of a damsel in distress. Men raised brows and muttered that the Ashbury girl must be far cleverer than she appeared to have snared two suitors at once, and though Helena bore their scrutiny with practiced composure, each remark sank like a needle beneath her ribs, filling her with a shame that did not belong to her. At a garden luncheon in Mayfair, she overheard Lady Morton murmur that Helena was teetering on the edge of impropriety, and that a woman who invited such attention before her wedding could hardly be trusted after it. At a musicale 3 nights later, she noticed a pair of matrons whispering behind their gloves, eyes flicking toward her with disdain as one muttered that her beauty was of the fragile sort that tempts disaster. Even the younger debutantes, girls who once admired her grace, now watched her with the sharpened interest of spectators, anticipating a scandal that would feed them for the rest of the season. Yet beneath the sting of gossip, Helena felt an unexpected, intoxicating spark of liberation as she walked beside Adrian. He remained a steadfast presence, his quiet confidence carving a protective circle around her, even as he pretended not to notice the whispers that trailed in their wake. Every time someone attempted to corner her with barbed questions, Adrian materialized with immaculate timing, offering his arm, redirecting conversation, or simply fixing the offender with a cool, aristocratic stare that sent them scattering like startled quail. But Helena sensed the truth beneath his composed veneer. Each insult directed at her lodged itself under his skin like a brand, feeding a controlled, simmering fury he refused to unleash prematurely. And yet, for all his restraint, he did not withdraw, not even when a viscount muttered that his attentions were unseemly, not even when Redcliffe himself confronted Helena in a crowded ballroom and accused her of humiliating him by allowing a duke to show her such obvious favor. Helena had felt the old fear rising, the instinct to shrink, to smooth over conflict for the sake of peace, but Adrian stepped between them before she could speak, bowing with icy courtesy as he remarked, "The lady is overwhelmed by your concern, Baron. Perhaps you might show equal care for her comfort as for your pride." The room had frozen. Redcliffe had sputtered in outrage, and Helena, standing with her hand on the Duke's arm, felt something inside her shift permanently. The world might twist their story into scandal, but Adrian made it clear with every action, every word, every look, that he would withstand any storm to shield her. And for the first time since her nightmare began, Helena found herself believing she might actually survive it. The storm broke on a night so heavy with rain that the very windows of Ashbury Hall trembled beneath its weight. A night when Helena should have been safe within her chamber, yet found herself instead standing outside her father's study, heart hammering as raised voices spilled through the door with a violence that made her skin prickle. Baron Redcliffe had arrived unannounced, again, and this time he brought no veneer of civility, no polite mask to soften his intentions, only the hard gleam of a man accustomed to shaping the world through threats. Helena pushed the door open just far enough to see her father, pale and sweating, sitting rigidly in his chair, while Redcliffe loomed over him like a shadow carved from malice. "I have indulged enough delays," the Baron snarled, slamming a hand onto the desk with such force that ink splattered across scattered papers. "Your daughter's excursions with the Duke have made me a laughingstock. If the wedding does not proceed at once, I will call in every debt you owe me. Ashbury will crumble, and you will face the consequences publicly." Her father stammered out excuses, weak, trembling pleas that he simply needed more time, but Redcliffe cut him off with a vicious curse. "You have no time. She will marry me next week. She will walk down that aisle if I must drag her there myself." Those words struck Helena like a blow, and before she could stop herself, she stepped fully into the room, her voice slicing through the thick air. "You will not." Redcliffe spun, shock flickering across his features before fury swallowed it whole. "You," he spat, eavesdropping like a child. Helena held her ground, though her pulse roared in her ears. "I heard enough," she said, her tone steady in a way that astonished even her. "I will not be forced into marriage. I will not pledge myself to a man who uses fear as currency." Redcliffe took a step toward her, and her father lurched to his feet, hands trembling, but Helena lifted her chin higher, refusing to cower. "If you destroy Ashbury," she continued, "then you destroy the lives of families who have done nothing to you. If you drag my father through public courts, you prove not strength, but cruelty." The Baron's face twisted into something almost feral. "You mistake me, Lady Helena. I do not need your consent. A ruined woman is still a compliant one." For a heartbeat, terror clawed at her throat, but then a clarity like ice washed through her. "I would rather be ruined," she said quietly, "than be owned." Silence dropped like a stone. Redcliffe's breath heaved, his fury incandescent, but something in Helena's unflinching gaze made him hesitate, only for a moment, but enough. He swept from the room with a vow that this defiance would cost her dearly. When he was gone, Helena sagged against the edge of the desk, trembling as her father whispered her name in despair. But even through her fear, she felt a quiet triumph bloom. She had stood, she had spoken, and when Adrian learned of this night, as he surely would, he would not see a fragile girl fighting shadows. He would see a woman choosing her own dignity, even if it meant walking headfirst into ruin. By the next morning, the house felt caught between silence and collapse, the air thick with the ghosts of last night's confrontation. As Helena descended the stairs with a resolve that seemed to sharpen with every step, she knew Redcliffe would strike soon. Men like him never let defiance settle without retaliation, but she also knew that retreat was no longer a possibility, not after she had looked him in the eye and rejected the future he tried to force upon her. When Adrian and Mr. Harland arrived soon after breakfast, Helena felt something in her chest ease, just slightly, as though their very presence pushed back the suffocating dread clinging to Ashbury's walls. They were shown into the small library where the morning light stretched pale and uncertain across the rugs, and as Helena joined them, she saw immediately that Harland carried not despair, but restrained excitement, a careful but unmistakable glint of opportunity. "My lady," he began, laying a sheaf of crisp documents on the table, "there is a clause in the engagement contract, easily overlooked but legally significant, that may alter everything." He slid one page forward, tapping a single sentence written in elegant, deceptively simple script. "The union shall proceed upon the willing and uncoerced consent of both parties at the time of the ceremony." Helena read it once, twice, her pulse quickening. Harland explained that while such clauses were often ceremonial flourishes, in cases involving large transfers of assets or property, such as Ashbury's land, it became legally binding. "If you publicly refuse consent," he said, "the marriage cannot proceed. Any attempt by Baron Redcliff to force it would violate his own contract." The room seemed to tilt, the weight of the world shifting from Helena's shoulders to something she could finally grasp with both hands. "But to challenge him," she murmured, "I must stand against not only the Baron, but my father and society. Everyone will know." "Yes," Adrian said softly, stepping forward as though drawn by her awakening resolve. "You would face scandal, perhaps condemnation. Your father's debts would become public. But you would be free, Helena, and more importantly, you would be choosing your own fate." She looked up at him then, truly looked, seeing not the Duke society whispered about, but the man who had stood beside her at every turn, steady, unwavering, willing to risk everything for her dignity. Fear rose in her, like a tide, yet beneath it lay something stronger, a fierce, burgeoning certainty. "If I speak this refusal," she whispered, "it must be in the church, before the vicar, before the congregation, before Redcliffe himself." Harland nodded. "A public declaration ensures he cannot twist the narrative. It is the strongest and safest application of the clause." Helena exhaled slowly, feeling her courage harden into something diamond bright. A public refusal meant instant scandal, her name whispered with pity or disdain for years to come. But she thought of Redcliffe's tightened grip, her father's trembling fear, the tenants whose futures depended on her choice, and suddenly scandal seemed a small price for freedom. She lifted her chin with quiet, unshakable resolve. "Then I will refuse," she said. "I will stand before God and everyone, and I will choose myself." And in that moment Adrian looked at her with such fierce, quiet pride that her knees nearly gave way, because she understood now that she was no longer fighting alone, but stepping into a destiny she was strong enough to claim. The eve of the wedding arrived like a noose tightening, each hour slipping past with a suffocating inevitability that made Helena feel as though she were moving through a dream carved from ice, a dream in which she could see her own future crumbling ahead of her, unless she found the strength to shatter it herself. Ashbury Hall had been overrun since dawn with dressmakers, florists, footmen and clerics, all orchestrated by Redcliffe's iron will. It no longer resembled her home, but a glittering prison braced for the ceremony that would seal her fate. The corridors echoed with hurried footsteps, whispered gossip, and the rustle of silk as maids carried her wedding gown, exquisite, expensive, and utterly suffocating, into her chamber. Helena stood at the window, watching the last of the afternoon light bleed across the sky, her hands clenched so tightly the knuckles whitened. She felt hollowed out, suspended between terror and defiance, her mind replaying the clause Harland had uncovered, willing and uncoerced consent, words that felt like a lifeline and a sword all at once. But to wield them, she would have to walk into a church filled with peers who expected her obedience, and then shatter that expectation in a single, irrevocable breath. Her father entered her room then, shoulders sagging beneath a weight partly of his own making, partly of the world's cruelty. He looked at her gown, at her pale but resolute face, and something in him crumpled. "Helena," he whispered, voice frayed with shame, "I never meant for you to bear this alone." She turned to him, gentle but unwavering. "You did not mean it," she agreed, "but you allowed it." He flinched, and for a fleeting moment she saw not a careless man but a frightened one who had gambled too long with his own life and now sought salvation in hers. "If you refuse him," he said, grief and terror warring in his eyes, "Redcliff will destroy us." She stepped closer, her voice steady despite her trembling heart. "If I marry him, he destroys us more completely." There was no argument left in him. He bowed his head and wept softly into his hands, and Helena felt a pang of sorrow but not regret. She kissed his brow, a farewell to the last vestiges of the girl she had been. Far from Ashbury, Adrian Ravensmere prepared for the same dawn with a very different resolve. His study glowed with candlelight as he and Harland reviewed their final documents, each detail a weapon forged to protect Helena's autonomy. There was no hesitation in Adrian's movements anymore, no doubt in his voice, when he practiced the objection he would speak at the ceremony if Helena faltered under the crushing weight of scrutiny. "If anyone knows cause," the vicar would say, and Adrian would step forward, unflinching, unashamed. He knew the risk: reputational ruin, political backlash, the mockery of Parliament. But none of it mattered, because in Helena's quiet courage, in the way she had stood against Redcliff, he had found something worth far more than reputation. He had found truth. As the night deepened, he closed the final document and whispered into the stillness, "She will not face him alone." And for the first time since this nightmare began, Helena slept, not without fear, but wrapped in the certainty that she was no longer walking toward her doom, but toward her defiance. Dawn crept over Ashbury like a reluctant promise, pale light spilling across the fields as though even the sun hesitated to witness what the day demanded. And Helena stood before her mirror in a gown she had never chosen, feeling the weight of every pearl, every stitch, every perfectly placed fold pressing against her like the walls of a cage. Maids flitted around her in hushed, reverent tones, mistaking her stillness for bridal nerves, instead of the quiet fury coiled beneath her ribs. The reflection staring back at her was beautiful in the way sacrificial things often are, too polished, too pristine, too perfectly groomed for a future not her own. Her veil lay pooled across her arms like a shroud. For a moment, she closed her eyes and inhaled, summoning the memory of Adrian's steady gaze, the reminder that today she would not bow, not break, not surrender her will to a man who believed she had none. When her father entered, he did so quietly, as if afraid to intrude upon something fragile, but Helena turned to him with a calm that startled them both. "Shall we?" she asked, and he nodded, unable to hide the tremor in his hands as he offered his arm. The carriage ride to the chapel was a study in contrasts. Outside, spring bird song filled the air, but inside the carriage, tension pressed against Helena like a second skin. She watched the landscape roll past, fields she had known since childhood blurring into a single resolve. She would not leave this place bound to a man who saw her as currency. At the chapel, guests adorned in pastel finery and polished jewels gathered like spectators awaiting a spectacle, their curious gazes following her as she stepped down from the carriage. Murmurs fluttered through the crowd, admiration, pity, speculation, all of it blending into a low hum beneath the sound of the church bells tolling her supposed joy. Redcliff stood near the altar with the smug composure of a man who believed victory inevitable, his eyes sweeping over her form with proprietary satisfaction that made her stomach twist. She kept her chin high, refusing to let him see even a flicker of the fear churning beneath her composure. The walk down the aisle felt endless, each step echoing like the beat of a war drum. Guests rose, forming a sea of faces, some expectant, some judgmental, some oblivious to the quiet storm brewing. Helena's heart thudded violently, but her grip on her father's arm remained steady. When they reached the altar, she stepped forward alone, her spine straightening as though held up by an invisible force, a force that felt suspiciously like the courage Adrian had breathed into her over the past weeks. And there, among the assembly, she found him. The Duke of Ravensmere stood tall, carved from unshakable resolve, his gaze fixed solely on her. Their eyes met, and it was as if the chapel faded into nothing but breath and heartbeat. She saw no judgment, no fear, only an unspoken vow that he would stand with her the moment she chose to break the chains binding her. The vicar cleared his throat, lifting his hands in solemn preparation. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice reverberating through the vaulted ceiling, "we are gathered here today." Helena's pulse surged, her breath caught, and as the words washed over her, she felt her courage bloom into something vast, something unstoppable. Today would not end in her surrender. Today would mark her defiance. Today, at last, she would reclaim her voice. The chapel fell into a hush so complete that Helena could hear her own heartbeat as a distant, trembling drum beneath her ribs. Every face turned toward the vicar as he reached the moment that would decide the course of her life, his voice rolling solemnly through the vaulted space. If any person knows a just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now. For half a heartbeat, silence held, a fragile glass that seemed to hover on the edge of shattering, until a single figure stepped forward from the pews with a composure so absolute it commanded the attention of every soul present. Adrian Ravensmere moved with deliberate grace, his dark coat cutting a sharp line through the soft candlelight, his presence igniting a ripple of gasps that spread through the congregation like wildfire. Helena's breath seized in her throat, though they had planned for this moment, seeing him rise, seeing him risk everything, reputation and legacy alike, struck her with a force that bordered on awe. He bowed briefly to the vicar before turning toward the assembly, his voice carrying with the cold clarity of steel drawn in defense. "I object," he said, and the words cracked through the silence like thunder. More murmurs erupted, shocked, scandalized, incredulous, but Adrian did not falter. "This marriage cannot proceed," he declared, "because the bride's consent has not been freely given. She stands here under coercion, entangled in a contract born of financial manipulation and threats against her family." Redcliff lurched forward, sputtering with outrage. "This is slander," he barked, face mottling red. But Adrian raised a hand, calm, commanding, unshakable. "I speak only the truth," he said, meeting the Baron's fury with an icy resolve that made even Helena's breath hitch. Then, turning back to the vicar, he extended a sheaf of documents, Harlan's meticulous work gleaming under the candlelight. "Here stands proof of the debts imposed, the conditions forced, the clause declaring this union valid only with the bride's willing, uncoerced consent." The vicar, trembling slightly, accepted the papers, scanning them with a furrowed brow. Redcliff lunged again, voice cracking with rage. "You overstep, Ravensmere. This is not your affair." But Adrian did not so much as blink. "It is my affair," he answered quietly, "when a woman is treated as property. It is my affair when injustice is carried out under the guise of marriage. And it is my affair," his gaze flicked toward Helena, softening infinitesimally, "when someone's freedom is threatened for another man's gain." The crowd erupted, shocked whispers, sharp intakes of breath, a few gasps of admiration mingled with scandalized outrage. Helena felt the weight of the moment crash over her, not as fear but as a sudden, breathtaking sense of being seen, truly, wholly seen. The vicar, pale and rattled, turned toward her, his voice unsteady. "Lady Helena, is this true?" And with that question, the world seemed to tighten around her like a noose or unfurl like a banner, depending on what she chose next. Her hands trembled, her heart thundered, and yet beneath it all, a powerful certainty surged. Adrian had stepped forward. Adrian had risked everything, and now the next step, the decisive blow, belonged to her. Helena felt the weight of 100 gazes upon her as she stood before the altar, the vicar's question still echoing through the charged silence, her pulse thundering so loudly she wondered if the entire chapel could hear it. Every breath she drew seemed to scrape against the cage that had held her for so long, a cage constructed by debt and expectation, and the cold cruelty of a man who believed he owned her fate. She looked first at Redcliff, whose expression had twisted into something vicious and feral, his lips peeled back in a snarl barely concealed beneath the veneer of aristocratic composure. His eyes burned with the promise of punishment, of humiliation, of ruin. Once, that gaze had frozen her with terror, but not today, not now. Because when she turned her head, her gaze collided with Adrian's, steady, unwavering, alight with a fierce, quiet pride that struck her with the force of a revelation. This man had stepped into the storm for her without hesitation, without calculation, not to claim her but to defend her right to choose her own life. And with that realization came a kind of calm, a spreading warmth that steadied her trembling limbs as she lifted her chin and faced the vicar. "My consent," she began, her voice soft yet carrying through the chapel like a clear bell, "has never been freely given." A collective gasp rippled through the pews, but she did not falter. She took one step forward, then another, each movement shedding a layer of fear. "I have been threatened, coerced, and used as leverage against my family. I was asked to sacrifice my future, not for love, not for partnership, but for a contract written in desperation." Her voice strengthened, gathering momentum like a river breaking through ice. "I will not sign my life away to a man who believes women are bargains to be struck. I refuse this marriage." Redcliffe lunged toward her with a sputtered roar of fury, but Adrian stepped forward instantly, positioning himself between them with the effortless finality of a shield, silent, immovable, unbreakable. The congregation surged in alarm, the vicar stumbling back in shock, but Helena held her ground, refusing to let the Baron's outrage overshadow her truth. "You foolish girl!" Redcliffe spat past Adrian's shoulder, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You think a declaration in church frees you? You think this spectacle, protects you from the consequences?" Helena felt her heart hammer, but she did not waver. She met his glare with a calm born not of fearlessness but of determination. "It protects me from you," she said, her tone soft but cutting. "And it protects the people of Ashbury from the ruin you planned for them." Redcliffe reeled back at the accusation, shock slicing through his fury, but the damage was done. Witnesses had heard the truth, the vicar had documents in hand, and Adrian towered between them like a wall of iron. The chapel erupted, half in scandal, half in awe, but Helena heard none of it. She felt only the profound release of a chain falling from her soul, the breath she had been unable to draw for months finally filling her lungs. And when Adrian looked back at her, the smallest, most reverent smile touched his lips, as if she had just performed the bravest act he had ever witnessed. Chaos unfurled through the chapel with the ferocity of a windstorm, guests rising from the pews in panicked waves as accusations, denials, and frantic whispers collided in a crescendo of outrage. But Helena stood rooted at the center of it all, strangely calm now that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. It was as though the world had cracked open, and, instead of falling, she had stepped through onto solid ground for the first time in her life. Redcliffe, however, was far from defeated. His face had turned a mottled crimson, veins pulsing at his temple, and the raw fury in his eyes made several guests shrink back as he lunged forward again, spitting venom through clenched teeth. "You will regret this," he snarled, reaching for her before Adrian intercepted him with a controlled swiftness that rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. The Duke did not shove him. He did not need to. He simply stepped into Redcliffe's path, posture carved from unassailable steel, voice low enough to carry the unmistakable weight of a command. "Take one more step toward her," Adrian said, "and you will not walk out of this chapel." The air tightened, the threat settling like frost on stone. For a moment, Redcliffe faltered, fury warring with the realization that he had been publicly bested. Then he whirled toward the guests instead, pointing an accusing finger at Helena. "You have all been deceived. This girl is manipulating you, manipulating him, to escape ruin. And you, Ravensmere," he spat, "you have destroyed any chance for Ashbury's survival." But Harland stepped forward then with the calm efficiency of a man presenting indisputable evidence to a court. He addressed the congregation with clear, measured authority. "A clause in the engagement contract renders this union invalid without the bride's willing consent. Lady Helena has refused. The Baron's enforcement of this marriage would constitute coercion, and the law will not support it." Gasps rippled through the crowd again, but Redcliffe's expression twisted into something uglier. "Law?" he scoffed. "What law protects a girl whose entire family fortune lies in shambles?" Harland's gaze did not flicker. "The same law," he replied, "that will examine the Baron's predatory financial dealings, should any challenge be raised against Lady Helena or her father." A deadly silence fell. Redcliffe's bravado cracked, the hint of real fear slicing through his bluster. He looked between them, Helena's steady defiance, Adrian's impenetrable stance, Harland's readiness to dismantle him, and something inside him broke. With a choked curse, he stormed down the aisle, shoving past guests who recoiled as if he carried contagion. When the chapel doors slammed behind him, the sound echoed like a final verdict. Helena exhaled, a breath she felt she had been holding for months, and the release nearly buckled her knees. Her father sank into a pew with a sob of relief, shoulders shaking under the weight of consequences finally shifting off his daughter's back. The vicar murmured a prayer under his breath, shaken but profoundly grateful the ceremony had not become a travesty. And Adrian, steadfast, unyielding Adrian, turned to her with eyes filled not with triumph, but with something infinitely gentler. "You were extraordinary," he said, his voice a whisper meant only for her. Helena felt warmth spread through her chest, fragile and overwhelming. She had refused a fate she had been told was inevitable. She had stood before an entire congregation and chosen herself. And in the quiet aftermath of that courage, she found herself wondering what new chapter might now be possible, with a man who had risked everything to give her the chance to write it. The journey back to Ashbury Hall unfolded beneath a sky still bruised from the morning storm, the carriage wheels cutting through wet gravel as Helena sat between her father and her own trembling thoughts, the memory of the chapel lingering like a vivid dream she had only just awakened from. She kept replaying the moment she spoke her refusal, the moment Adrian stepped forward, the moment Redcliff's mask finally cracked, each recollection sending a fresh wave of disbelief and fragile strength through her. Her father sat slumped beside her, hands shaking as though stripped of years of denial, and when he finally broke the silence, his voice wavered with remorse. "My darling, what you did today, I never imagined you capable of such courage." Helena turned toward him, seeing the truth of his guilt etched into every weary line of his face, and though her heart ached, there was a soft, resolute clarity in her reply. "Courage was all that remained to me, father," she murmured, "and I could not allow myself, or Ashbury, to be chained to a man like Redcliffe." He bowed his head, overcome, and whispered that he would spend the rest of his days trying to repair what he had broken. Helena reached for his hand, not with the forgiveness of a child, but with the tempered grace of a woman who understood that love and disappointment could coexist without destroying her. When the carriage pulled up to the estate, servants rushed out, their faces a mixture of fear and anticipation, for news had travelled faster than horses. They bowed deeply to Helena, not out of duty but gratitude, for they understood what Redcliffe's ownership of Ashbury would have meant for their families, their homes, their very futures. She greeted each of them with a gentle, steady nod, feeling an anchor settle within her chest. This place, these people, this land was part of her, and she had chosen to fight for it. Inside the hall, afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting warm gold across the entryway, where Adrian awaited her with a presence so commanding and yet so tender that her breath caught at the sight of him. He had arrived ahead of her, ensuring Ashbury's security, ensuring Redcliffe had not dared to return, ensuring she walked into safety rather than remnants of fear. When their eyes met, everything else fell away: the storm, the scandal, the whispers of society, even the uncertainty of the future. Adrian stepped forward slowly, as though afraid any swifter movement might overwhelm her, his voice a low, reverent murmur. "You are unhurt?" She nodded, though her pulse hammered from the raw intensity of his concern. "I am free," she whispered, and the words trembled between them like something sacred. He exhaled as if he had been holding that breath since the church, his shoulders finally easing, and for the briefest moment, Helena saw something unguarded in his expression, a depth of feeling he had been restraining for far too long. But he did not reach for her, did not claim her, did not dare step beyond the line propriety still sketched faintly between them. Instead, he bowed his head with a quiet reverence usually reserved for saints and said, "Then the world is brighter for it." And Helena realized, with a slow, rising warmth that curled through her like light, that freedom was not an ending at all. It was the beginning of a life she would choose, and perhaps, if fate allowed, a love she would step into willingly, fully, fiercely. For the first time since childhood, Helena awoke the next morning without the weight of dread coiled in her stomach, and yet freedom, real freedom, felt almost too immense to hold, as though she had stepped onto unfamiliar ground that trembled beneath her feet. She wandered the halls of Ashbury in a soft morning gown, sunlight filtering through tall windows and warming her skin like a benediction, but her thoughts spun with too many questions to let peace settle fully. What would become of the estate now that Redcliffe's influence had been severed? Could her father's debts be untangled without surrendering Ashbury's land? And, more fragile still, what lay between herself and Adrian? Was it merely gratitude and shared battle, or something far deeper? Something growing with such quiet power she almost feared to look at it directly. She found herself gravitating toward the gardens, the place where so many whispered truths had bloomed between them, and was not surprised to see Adrian there already, standing beneath the great elm tree, hands clasped behind his back as though bracing himself against the countless responsibilities that awaited him. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and the softness that crossed his face was almost enough to undo her composure. "Lady Helena," he said gently, though the formality felt fragile now, stretched thin over something warmer that glowed in his eyes. She approached slowly, fingers brushing the tops of the lavender bushes as though gathering courage from their scent. "I wanted to thank you," she said, voice steadier than she expected, "for everything you have done, and everything you risked." He shook his head, a faint, rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "What I did was necessary. You stood in greater courage than I." She felt her breath catch at the sincerity of his words, but before she could respond, he continued, his tone shifting to something more somber. Harland and I have begun drafting protections, legal and financial, to stabilize your father's debts without allowing predatory hands near Ashbury again. It will take time, but it is possible. Relief washed through her, mingled with a tenderness that frightened her with its depth. You owe us nothing, she whispered. Yet you continue to fight for us. Adrian's gaze darkened with a storm of emotion. He seemed almost afraid to release. Helena, he said softly, I did not fight for Ashbury. I fought for you. The air thickened, her heart stuttering in her chest, but he lifted a hand, hesitant, reverent, and then let it fall again, restrained by a boundary he feared to cross. But you have endured much, he murmured. I will not presume upon your gratitude, nor tarnish your newfound freedom with my own desires. His restraint broke something open in her, a realization that his love, if she dared name it such, was not a cage but a choice given freely, held gently, awaiting her answer rather than demanding it. She stepped closer, close enough that morning light painted gold against his dark coat, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence seep through her bones. Adrian, she said quietly, my freedom is not something you could tarnish. You helped me claim it. Her voice trembled with the beginning of confession, but before she could speak further, a footman hurried toward them with a message urgent enough to drain the warmth from the moment. Helena exchanged a glance with Adrian, fear flickering through her newly fragile peace. Whatever had come, it threatened to shift everything once again. The footman's breathless arrival shattered the fragile intimacy of the garden, and as Helena unfolded the sealed letter he carried, her pulse quickened with a dread that felt all too familiar, for the heavy wax bore the unmistakable crest of Baron Redcliff, a mark she had hoped never to see again. Adrian moved instinctively closer, not quite touching her, but standing near enough that she could draw strength from his presence as she broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter inside was written in Redcliff's sharp, cruel hand, every stroke of ink carrying the poison of a man who refused to accept defeat. You may have embarrassed me in that chapel, it began, but do not imagine you have escaped the consequences. Helena swallowed hard, continuing even as her vision blurred at the edges. Redcliff detailed in chilling clarity the legal ruin he intended to unleash not upon her, but upon her father and the tenants of Ashbury. He threatened lawsuits, the seizing of properties tied to unpaid interest, the public ruin of Lord Ashbury's name, and even hinted at fabricated charges that could entangle innocent villagers in legal battles they could not afford. You have chosen war, the letter concluded, and I intend to repay the insult tenfold. Helena felt the words like cold steel tightening around her throat. She folded the letter carefully, though her hands shook, and when she lifted her gaze to Adrian, she found not shock in his expression, but fury carved with such quiet precision it sent a shiver through her. He took the letter from her without a word, reading it with the controlled composure of a man calculating every possible outcome. He is unhinged, Helena whispered, her voice cracking beneath the weight of Redcliff's threat. He means to harm not only us, but everyone depending on this estate. Adrian exhaled slowly, the kind of breath one draws before stepping into a dangerous fire. This is not merely vindictiveness, he said. This is desperation, and desperation is predictable. He turned to her fully then, his voice steady, resolute. Helena, listen to me. Redcliff no longer has legal grounds to act as he threatens. His influence relies on fear he no longer has the power to enforce. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let his certainty anchor her. But the image of Ashbury's tenants, families she had known since childhood, flashed before her eyes. If even one of his threats is real, she murmured, their livelihoods hang in the balance. Adrian stepped closer, his voice lowering into something meant for her alone. Then we will stop him. You will not face this storm again, not alone, not unprotected. For a heartbeat her strength faltered, the weight of responsibility threatening to crush her hard-won freedom. But Adrian's hand rose, hovering near her cheek in a gesture so tender it nearly undid her. He did not touch her, not yet, but the warmth of his presence steadied the wild tremor in her chest. He thinks you vulnerable, Adrian said softly, but he has forgotten that you are no longer fighting for survival. You are fighting for justice, and that is a battle he cannot win. Helena drew a breath, allowing his words to root within her like something solid, something luminous. The fear did not vanish, but it transformed, tempered by the knowledge that she was no longer the frightened girl trapped in obligation. She was a woman who had defied a baron in front of an entire congregation, and she was standing beside a man who would burn down the world before he let harm come to her or Ashbury. She lifted her chin, resolve sharpening once more. "Then we finish this," she whispered. Adrian nodded, the faintest glimmer of pride in his eyes. Together, what followed was not a clash of swords or tempers, but the quiet, devastating precision of truth brought into the light. And as Helena, Adrian, and Mr. Harland gathered in the Ashbury study that evening, candles flickering against the dark wood paneling, the storm outside casting trembling shadows across the room, she felt the weight of their purpose settle around them like a mantle she was no longer afraid to wear. Harland spread documents across the polished desk, each one a carefully unearthed piece of Redcliff's corruption. Falsified loan ledgers, predatory interest schemes disguised as benevolent aid, land grab contracts signed with men desperate enough to accept any terms, and even letters linking him to the very syndicate Helena had feared would swallow Ashbury whole. "This," Harland said, tapping the damning forms, "is not merely unethical. It is criminal." Helena listened, her breath unsteady as she absorbed the magnitude of Redcliff's deceit. He had not only sought to control her, but to build an empire of ruin upon the backs of the vulnerable. "If we bring this forward," she whispered, "he will fight like a cornered animal." Adrian stepped closer, the quiet power of his presence easing the tightness in her chest. "Let him," he murmured. "He is already losing, and when men like Redcliffe lose, it is not honor they cling to, it is panic." For a moment, Helena closed her eyes, summoning strength from the memory of the chapel. The moment she spoke her truth to a room full of witnesses who expected obedience and received defiance instead, she opened her eyes with new resolve. "We present everything," she said. "Not in secret, not quietly, publicly. He threatened my family in the open. Let his downfall be just as visible." Harland nodded, already assembling the documents into a cohesive case. "I will take this to the magistrate at once. Redcliffe's influence will not protect him from the law once these details are exposed." But Helena knew the Baron well enough to expect retaliation of another kind, a final attempt to claw back control through intimidation, and the thought tightened her throat until Adrian's hand brushed the air near hers, not touching, but steady and sure, an unspoken vow. "He will come after me," she murmured, meeting Adrian's gaze. "He will not accept being outmaneuvered." "Let him come," Adrian replied, voice low with a resolve that made her heart twist. "I have stood between you and danger before. I will do so again." A soft knock interrupted them, and a footman entered with a pale expression, announcing that a messenger had arrived from London with news that Redcliffe had already left the city, heading toward Ashbury. Panic flickered in Helena's chest, raw and immediate, but Adrian placed a calming hand on the back of her chair, steady as iron. "It changes nothing," he said. "He is desperate, but desperation cannot undo truth." Helena exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in her limbs give way to a fierce, burning resolve. The sun had long set, but the night ahead felt charged with purpose, not fear. "Then let him come," she whispered, strength rising like fire in her veins. "He will arrive to find a battle he cannot win, and a woman he no longer has the power to break." Redcliffe arrived at Ashbury as dusk bled into night, the sky streaked with molten violet as though the heavens themselves strained against what was about to unfold. And Helena felt the air shift the moment the sound of hooves thundered up the gravel drive, violent, reckless, the herald of a man who had lost all pretense of civility. She stood in the entry hall beside Adrian, her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird beneath her ribs, but her spine remained straight, her chin raised, her resolve locked firmly into place. The great doors burst open with a force that rattled their hinges, and Redcliffe strode inside, soaked in sweat and fury, his hair disheveled from the ride, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man teetering on the edge of his own ruin. "Where is she?" he snarled, voice echoing across the marble floor. Helena stepped forward before Adrian could intercept, her expression calm, so calm it made Redcliffe falter for a fraction of a second. "I am here," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. His gaze snapped to her, venom twisting his features. "You," he hissed. "You have cost me everything. You dare humiliate me in church. You dare poison my reputation." He surged toward her, hand raised as though ready to seize her again, but Adrian moved between them with such swift precision that the Baron stumbled backward, shock flashing across his face. "Touch her," Adrian said softly, dangerously, "and I will consider it an act of violence." Redcliffe spat at his feet. "She is my fiancée. She is nothing of the sort. Helena cut in, her voice slicing through his lie like a blade. "I refuse the marriage. Before God, before witness, before law." Redcliffe trembled with rage, but the tremor beneath his anger was fear, true, bone-deep fear, for he knew that with public refusal and Harlan's legal case, his power had crumbled. Still, he clung to his delusions like drowning men cling to driftwood. "You think a refusal frees you?" he sneered. "You think hiding behind a duke saves you? I will drag you through courts, through scandal, through—" "No," Adrian interrupted, stepping forward with a quiet command that silenced even the footman watching from the shadows. "You will do nothing, because we have evidence, ledgers, letters, contracts, proving your predatory schemes. They are already en route to the magistrate." Redcliffe's face drained of color. "Lies," he choked out. But Harlan emerged from the study behind them, holding the stamped legal file. "Truth," he said firmly. "You will be investigated for fraud, extortion, and breach of contract. You are in no position to threaten anyone." Redcliffe's breath came in sharp, broken bursts, his bravado collapsing as the reality of his downfall closed around him. He looked at Helena then, not with affection, not with longing, but with the hollow rage of a man losing his last illusion of control. "You will pay for this," he whispered. Helena met his gaze without flinching. "I already have," she said softly, "but no more." Adrian stepped fully in front of her, a silent shield. Harlan signaled the waiting constable at the door, who stepped forward to escort the Baron out. Redcliffe's roar of protest echoed through the hall as he was dragged away, a final, futile cry from a man who had built his throne on fear and found it dissolved beneath him. When the doors slammed shut, Helena exhaled a trembling breath, her knees nearly giving way. Adrian caught her, not with possession, not with urgency, but with a gentle steadiness that made her heart twist with something deep and undeniable. "It is finished," he murmured. And for the first time, she truly believed him. When dawn broke over Ashbury the following morning, it did so with a softness that felt almost miraculous, pale gold spilling across the fields and through the tall windows of the estate, as though the very sunlight recognized the shift in the air, the lifting of a darkness that had clung to the house for far too long. Helena stood on the terrace wrapped in a light shawl, watching mist drift lazily across the gardens, her breath forming delicate clouds in the cool morning air. The world felt startlingly new, fragile in its quiet, as if waiting for her to take the first step into a future that now belonged entirely to her. She heard footsteps behind her, steady, measured, familiar, and although she did not turn immediately, a warmth unfurled inside her, one she had denied herself for too long. Adrian joined her at the railing, leaving a respectful space between them, even as his presence wrapped around her like a promise. They stood in silence for a moment, gazing out at the land Helena had fought for, the land she had protected with a courage she never believed herself capable of. "Ashbury is safe," Adrian said at last, his voice quiet but carrying a depth that resonated in her bones. "The magistrate accepted the evidence. Redcliffe will face the consequences of his actions, and his influence has evaporated." Relief washed through her slowly, warm and bittersweet. "It feels strange," she admitted softly, "to stand here and know that I am no longer trapped, no longer beholden to him." "Freedom," Adrian murmured, "often arrives quietly after a storm." She turned to him then, really looking at him, the man who had stood beside her in the darkest hours, who had risked reputation and power not to claim her, but simply to protect her right to choose her own path. A man carved from restraint and integrity, yet capable of a tenderness that made her heart tremble. He met her gaze with an intensity that softened at the edges, as though he were fighting the instinct to reach for her. "Helena," he said, her name low on his breath, "now that you are free, I must ask you something I dared not ask before." Her pulse fluttered, hope rising like a fragile bloom. "Ask," she whispered. Adrian took one step closer, still maintaining his careful restraint, yet unable to hide the truth blazing in his eyes. "Is there a place in your future," he murmured, "for a man who would cherish you not for obligation, not for advantage, but for the woman you are, for your courage, your mind, your heart?" The morning air stilled. Helena felt something inside her unfurl, something bright and fierce and tender all at once. "Yes," she breathed, the single word carrying every beating truth she had held within her. "If that man is you, yes." For the first time since she had known him, Adrian's composure cracked, just enough for warmth and joy to shine through. He lifted her hand slowly, reverently, as though touching something sacred, and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that made her knees weaken. Then, Helena, he whispered, let us begin again, this time not with fear, but with hope. She stepped closer, not timidly, not uncertainly, but with the grace of a woman claiming the life she chose, and rested her brow lightly against his. The sunrise bathed them both in gold, and as the world awakened around them, Helena felt her heart open to a future shaped not by coercion or duty, but by love freely chosen, fiercely earned, and wondrously, irrevocably hers.